Film, The Brussels Business, exposes the powerful lobbying industry in Europe. It initiates Europe-wide policy and drives negotiations of international free trade agreements. Clive, you've been looking into the lobbying business.
Yes, indeed, Ian. There was a story last summer from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that exposed £93 million that was paid by the City of London in 2011 for furthering corporate interests of typically banking and finance. That's most of what the city represents. And that money was used to influence policy, laws and regulations around the world.
And how does this work in Europe?
In Europe, and what the film shows, is that we already know there's a democratic deficit in Europe. Parliament doesn't make law in Europe. The EU commissioners actually draft the laws and put them to Parliament for Parliament to vote on. And what the film shows is that EU commissioners, and they show Leon Britton, basically just confessing that they're desperate for ideas. And the people that are on hand to present those ideas are the lobbying groups and the businesses. And so much of the policy that is formulated in Europe is both drafted by and amended and edited by companies, for companies. And they showed examples of actual policy documents coming out of the EU which were cut and paste from proposals from companies.
And there's these European Round Table seems to be very influential.
Well, the European Round Table is a lobbying group of some 50 of the major industrial companies.
Wow.
And there's something called the European Services Forum, which does something very similar for service companies. And the film is very good at getting close to the actual culprits, if you will, or the lobbyists, who were quite open about what they were doing and clearly don't see anything wrong with what they're doing. But clearly a lot of this happens behind closed doors.
So if you're a European commissioner and you defy the European Round Table, you've got the 50 biggest companies in Europe gunning for you.
Yes, although I don't get the impression that the commissioners are in any way intimidated by this. They welcome the input because they're not getting input from anywhere else.
But in case they were actually to do anything they didn't like, then they might
possibly
get turned nasty.
Well, that certainly didn't come across in the film. What one got from the film was that these commissioners have this brief to fabricate law to further the European project, and they desperately need input and they need resources. So the companies and the lobbying groups who've got massive resources are basically filling the policy vacuum that should be filled by representatives of the people, in effect.
So cutting government spending isn't always necessarily a good thing if it creates a vacuum that industry fills with its own wish list. Well, does this go beyond Europe?
It certainly does, and I think a couple of weeks ago we mentioned the US-EU free trade agreement, which basically opens the door for US healthcare companies who have a pretty appalling reputation in the US to come and buy their way into the NHS as part of the privatisation, and it's all happening in secret.
And are there other agreements going on at the moment as well that we don't know much about?
Yes, there's also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being negotiated, and this takes in countries like Australia, Brunei, Chile, Canada, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore and Vietnam, and Japan is knocking on the door to join as well. And this is not seen by Congress. There's a US Senator, Ron Wyden, who says that he can't get access to the negotiating documents, and yet companies like Halliburton, Chevron, Pharma, Comcast and the Motion Pictures Association of America not only have access to the documents, but they're consulted and they're part of the negotiations.
They're writing the documents.
Well, there are 600 corporate advisors actually drafting these agreements.
So if a US senator wants to find out what's going on, the White House won't tell him. He's got to go begging to the Motion Picture Corporations of America to find out what's being negotiated on behalf of his constituents.
Exactly. And
wonderful.
And they likely as not will not tell him what's going on. The thing to know about these agreements that have been negotiated by these corporate lobbyists is that they're irreversible. and they override sovereignty. In other words, they trump all national laws. So once these agreements are signed, any legislative body like the UK Parliament is hamstrung, can't do anything about it.
Wow.
But anyway, you were asking about
the film.
It's available on iTunes immediately. The DVD is coming out in May. There are screenings, but they're across Europe mainly. But there are details available at thebrusselsbusiness.eu.
Thebrusselsbusiness.eu.